All right, so what the goal is with this video is to walk you through, this is mainly juniors, the critical lenses we've been discussing in class with the end goal of being able to use these critical lenses to examine different things we read or watch this year and probably next year as well. I'll try to make this video quick or else it might just be like an hour. So we'll try to keep it under about 20 minutes. And hopefully I don't get interrupted. So when we're talking about critical lenses, what we're talking about, you can think of like different pairs of glasses we put on to understand the world in different ways or focusing on particular things, mostly different books and movies, but also just out in the world, right? It forces us to think about some things we might not otherwise think about. Again, basically everything we read and write this year will utilize these lenses. Most college writing utilizes critical lenses like this, either explicitly or implicitly. So we're practicing this now. Hopefully by the end, you'll be able to understand the complex and interconnected nature of this place we exist in, right? Typically, any issue you encounter in the world is always more complicated than it seems. And lenses help you kind of break that down a little. It will also help you fight against just talking without having to think about what you're saying. Hopefully this helps you kind of consider all the facts or consider alternatives for what might be happening in your life. So here are some of the lenses we'll go through. You can pause if you want to look at these, but if not, we can dial in. An important thing about these lenses is that they almost always stack on top of each other, right? An easy example is if we're looking at maybe gender in the United States workforce. There are several layers to that, right? We have gender. Well, we also have the economy, right? We also have wealth, and wealth typically relates to power, and power typically relates to other things like we could bring in race as a lens. So gender, race, power, money, all of those things tie in together in the context of the job market, right? How much people are getting paid for certain jobs. So that's a super easy example of how these stack on top of each other. And as I'm going through these, I'll point out some of the obvious examples of this. The word we're going to be using to describe media and things in the world is artifact. So an artifact is just something people have made, the clothes you're wearing, the computer you're watching this on, the book I'm reading right now, the YouTube video you just watched, the pictures on your wall, all of those things are artifacts. The first lens is, here's the fancy word, is hegemonic or hegemon. It's the Greek word referring to one thing that has power over another thing. So pretty easy. The big question here is, what does a system of power reveal about the artifact? An easy example of this is the artifact could be something like we just talked about, like the job somebody has, right? Maybe the structure is there's a boss and they have a boss, and the big boss has power over everyone below them, but the medium boss only has power around the people below them. That's kind of an easy example there. We might also look at things like the hegemonic lens will reveal systems of oppression, exploitation, right? By who has power over who and who is being exploited or used by that power. It can also help us understand the motivations of people, right? Why do they want the power? What will that help them gain? As well as people who resist those in power. What are they resisting? Why are they resisting it? And an important thing, especially if you maybe look like me, is it can help, hegemonic lens can help reveal or give insights into groups you are not a part of, a group you don't belong to. And that would be like a group of people based on race, religion, other aspects of their identity, right? Because if you can see how their specific grouping interacts with power, maybe you understand a little bit more about them and why they are the way they are, and maybe how they've had to encounter systems of oppression throughout history. So those are some of the takeaways that a hegemonic lens might reveal. And really, this one should be self-explanatory. We see systems of power all around us every day. Secondly is religion. Typically, a religious lens usually falls into like also kind of historical and also intertextual, which is something we'll talk about later. And the big question here is, what might a faith tradition reveal about this artifact? So if you're talking religion, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to use a religious lens, right? You have to talk specifically, I'm going to use a Buddhist lens, a Taoist lens, a Wicca lens, a Christian lens, etc. And so some possible insights if we put on a religious, those glasses that we might find are, maybe the book you're reading is just a retelling of some ancient story that's part of a religious tradition, right? Think Chronicles of Narnia is oftentimes an allegory for the New Testament, right? Specifically the Gospels. Maybe the lineage of this artifact comes from people looking for meaning, right? So maybe the book of poetry you're reading has religious undertones of mysticism, maybe Islamic mysticism. And also, a religious lens can help you define kind of good, bad, good, evil, what we call like a deontological view of the world, kind of the 10 Commandments style. And it says like, okay, what one religion says is good isn't necessarily what another one says is good or bad, right or wrong. And it depends on who is viewing it based on their religion. The next one is ecological. So this is something that basically anything that has to do with nature. And remember, when we talk about people, we like to kind of separate people from nature, but people are just as much a part of nature as trees, as the wind, as any other aspect of the earth. So the question here might be something like, what does this artifact tell us about the state of the world? And something you might look at is like, if you have a water bottle out on a desk near you, maybe it reveals that for whatever reason, people need to buy water and they don't have water accessible to them easily. Maybe you look at the plastic and the repercussion and the life cycle of that plastic, right? Remember, when we talk about artifacts, we aren't just talking about books or poems or songs. We're talking about literally anything people make. So that includes commodities like the clothes on your back. And remember, these stack with each other, these overlap a lot. So another possible insight is an ecological disaster would affect someone who is maybe poor, someone who's not in a privileged position, much worse than the rich. Oftentimes the rich don't encounter ecological disasters at all because they can afford to remove themselves. An easy example is the recent hurricanes that went up the East Coast. The people who perished from that were most likely people who were in situations because of their level of wealth where they couldn't afford to leave, or maybe they had to rent a basement apartment, and they didn't survive because of that, right? Kind of on the opposite end, those with power jeopardize the future through things like destroying the environment for money, what we might call capital gains, through things like launching rockets into space, just kind of for fun. And there are individuals as well as corporations that do this knowing the effect it'll have on you or your children or the people being born right now. And they do it anyway, right? There is another insight you could garner from this, that things are interdependent, right? A butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil right now might have an effect on a child born in South Korea in 12 years, right? These things in this planet are interconnected. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't seem to make sense how interconnected they are. But they are. Maybe the production of palm oil in Southeast Asia is affecting the water temperature off the coast of Western Canada. That could be a thing, right? So as a historical lens, the big question here is, what might a period of time reveal about a specific artifact? And And the easiest example is just to pick up an old book, watch an old film, look at paintings that were painted in Egypt 12,000 years ago. You could typically find out what life looked like for people back then based on what they created. You could find out what they cared about based on maybe what they saved, what they treasured, what they kept in their tombs. You could also kind of understand what people thought about religion, what people thought about art, what people thought about their legacy based on what they create in a specific period. So some possible insights kind of we already talked about. Artifact is responding to a specific event in history. Maybe a book is written right after World War II and it talks about the trauma that people have to go through in war. Maybe the meaning of a specific artifact changes over time or from place to place. A good example of this is how different people understand maybe the same religion based on where they are in the world and how that religion has been shaped by where they are in the world. You could look at maybe Eastern Orthodox Christianity versus Mennonite populations in the United States versus the modern evangelical church versus modern Catholic church. And you can look at that throughout time, how all of those things have formed, shaped, responded to each other, or had conflict with each other. You could also understand the artifact at different points in times, have them reveal different things. And someone is knocking at my door and I'm not happy about that. So let's go ahead and pause this. All right, so yeah, understanding that an artifact at different points of times reveals different things. Maybe a book you read as a child, you understand completely differently now as an adult. That's an easy example. Let's press on a moral lens. The big question here is, how does an artifact demonstrate goodness or how to value something, right? Does it try to teach you a lesson? You could think, yeah, a lot of religious texts, but also maybe just stories or movies you watched as a kid typically have like a good message with them. So a moral lens would be looking at that message. And some possible insights are the stories that we consume shape what we value, how we understand what is good in the world. We can also understand that decisions are good or bad depending on the context, right? Maybe if you're starving or your child is starving, suddenly it becomes okay to steal if that's the only way of feeding them, right? Depending on how you understand morality or good and bad, these ideas change depending on circumstance. Or another thing artifacts do is they can maybe demonstrate the way we want to live our life. Maybe we follow a really inspirational TikToker who helps us love ourselves better and maybe be more conscientious about the world and the words we say and the thoughts we think, right? That TikToker is all of a sudden doing some moral instruction, which isn't good or bad, but it just demonstrates how these artifacts can kind of shape how we view the world. The next lens here is a lens that centers race. Critical race theory takes kind of a little bit more research to really dive into, but everyone's able to utilize a lens that centers race. And the big question here is, how does this artifact interact with systemic? So systemic is kind of top to bottom in the system, or interpersonal between two people, interpersonal racism, and cultural perceptions of race. Because depending on where you are in the world, people are going to understand this word differently. In the United States, in South Africa, people are going to have a very distinct understanding of it. But maybe in China, maybe in Guatemala, the perception around race will be a little bit different. Some possible insights that one's race touches every aspect of one's life. And if you are not a person of color, this might not be obvious. And it wasn't for me, that's for sure. That anything from employment to where you live to familial wealth, a lot of that has to do with race. Another possible insight is racism is what is done and what is not done, right? The laws that are passed and the laws that are not passed, the comments that are said, but also the comments that aren't said. And another probably obvious insight here is power. So thinking that hegemonic lens again is had by some, but not others as a result of historical racism, right? Historical racism has shaped the world, has shaped the lives of families, especially in the United States, solely on the basis of race. So then we're diving in a little bit to gender. So the big question here with gender is looking at an artifact, how does it conform to or deviate from societal expectations around gender, right? We talk about if there's a Disney movie with a princess, you assume there's going to be a prince, right? Because of societal expectations. In most cases there are, but then all of a sudden we have a movie like Frozen where Elsa doesn't have a prince. And so it deviates, it separates from that expectation. And that can ruffle some feathers or cause people to raise questions. And also, what insights around gender can this artifact give us? Can it teach us something? Can it demonstrate something that maybe goes against popular conceptions of gender? So some possible insights might be that expectations around gender are formed by social environments, right? Maybe in some parts of the world, there are some gender roles that we don't have here because their society is different. In the United States, for sure, these expectations have changed over time because the social environment has also changed over time. And remember that gender is not a binary, sorry. So binary meaning two options, right? But we know that gender is a spectrum. But society is still set up to where we treat gender as if it were a binary. Because it's easier for people to have control over and understand, because like we mentioned earlier, everything's a little bit more complex than it seems. And so if you break gender norms, if you step out of that non-binary, or if you step out of that binary into a non-binary space, it can lead to backlash from in-power groups, right? You could imagine, and this was the example we used in class, if I showed up to school in a really cute dress, probably I get some looks, but at the end of the day, it'd probably be fine. I bet you if I was maybe in the American Midwest or the South, I would probably be removed from the school by force, right? Because breaking gender norms freaks people out. And can lead to backlash, typically violence from in-power groups. And this is especially important to remark trans women and trans women of color, especially have had to bear the brunt of this throughout time. So on a somewhat related note, here we're talking a little bit about sexuality and queer theory. And remember, queer theory is the academic discipline, right? This was a term reclaimed by these communities. And the big question here is, what do the norms or the shifting of norms in terms of sexuality reveal about this artifact? Some possible insights we might gather are that throughout history, sexuality has always been non-binary, right? There's not just like one option, there's lots and lots of options. Despite socialized norms, remember, socialized norms is just because society doesn't like to deal with sticky things or things that are maybe hard to think about if you don't have to think about them every day. And a possible insight that should be obvious, but I feel like is worth saying because it wasn't always obvious for me, was that someone who does not fall into these heteronormative expectations, meaning hetero, referring to heterosexual, and normative, meaning normal, right? We're talking, if there's a princess, there's got to be a prince. That's what that means. Someone who does not fall into these heteronormative expectations experiences the world in unique and valid ways. Not just unique and valid ways, but ways that are worth learning about and listening to. So that's a good insight there. Here's our Marxist lens, and Marxist lens really just talks about wealth and who has wealth, but more so who doesn't, and the gap in between. So here's the big question: what can the gap between the rich and the poor tell us about an artifact or help us understand? And some possible insights are maybe that a character's poverty led them to make a risky choice they might not have made if they were well off, right? Maybe the power in your country is consolidated to the top 2% of people, and most people live in squalor and poverty. And maybe your family at one point had left to try to escape that, right? And in a related way, that the hopes of gaining wealth often moves families all over the world. Unless you're indigenous to Washington, at some point your family moved to Washington State, probably for better job prospects, for a maybe safer place to live, but most likely to try to gain wealth, right? So this is what we've been talking about most recently today. On the 23rd, we talked about this with a couple classes. It's our Ableist Lens. So this is a lens looking at people with disabilities, or also people who are able-bodied. And this is physical and mental. And so the central question here, it has to do with how we set up the world for some people, but not for others, based on their ability. So the reason you might not have heard too much about this, or really have to think about it, is because for able-bodied people, disability is often a signifier of death, right? Meaning that it reminds them that they're privileged, they experience the world in a way that where they don't have to think about their physical, maybe well-being or safety, like somebody with a disability would have to. Another possible insight, if we're trying to localize it here at school, is that schools are designed to teach some kids, but not others, based on ability. I know there are schools in Tacoma that don't have wheelchair access. A student in a wheelchair literally could not attend school there because they were built before that was a requirement. So they would have to go to a different school, right? But we also have things like mental disabilities. Some students just can't succeed in this, what you might think of as a typical classroom environment, because of something they didn't choose to have or could control, right? And this is all part of a broader sentiment that the world is intentionally created for some people and not others, depending on their ability. You could think of this through architecture, right? How people move it throughout the world, on buses, through cities, navigating with a wheelchair through different stores. Let's go ahead and talk about the next one, an intertextual lens. This will probably be the most common, especially in a college environment. And what we're really looking at here is like, how does one artifact influence our understanding about another artifact? So the most common example is maybe in a college class, you're asked to read 2 books, 2 stories, and then your essay is about what do they have in common, how are they different, how do they both develop your understanding of a certain idea that you're studying. So the picture here is a reference to The Birth of Venus, a Botticelli painting, but it's it's done with the Avengers, right? So it's using this one artifact, this painting, to maybe make a commentary or just kind of have fun with this idea here of the Avengers. So some possible insights, something you could realistically write an essay about. You could compare villains in the Avengers movies to villains in different Shakespeare plays. You could look at a poem such as Yeats's The Second Coming and look at how that poem is referenced by hip hop artists like 100 years later, such as The Roots or Kendrick Lamar, right? So anytime one artifact references another, that's what we call an intertextual lens. This next one is an existentialist lens, and it's definitely really oversimplified here. But this is kind of the real angsty stuff, kind of those big questions we're trying to answer, such as how is meaning made? Like, how do I know anything for real? How do I know what to value? How do I know what's important to do? How to spend my time? How is meaning made? Kind of those big angsty questions. And some possible insights you might gain as well. Individuals have to decide what meaning is, right? You have to make it for yourself, right? Meaning is a sweater that you have to knit for yourself. It could also help you realize that people are just out here doing the best they can. What's for me may not be for you. You may have come to different conclusions about the world, what's important than I have. But you also might realize that a lot of people never sit down and think about these things. A lot of people just go on in life because they have to, or that's what they've been conditioned to do. So an existentialist lens can kind of help you grapple with that and realize that maybe at the end of the day, life is just an absurd thing that we get to do. So you might as well embrace it. That's kind of the conclusion of the existentialist argument. And our final lens here is kind of references psychology a little bit. It's what we call a Freudian lens. So the big question here is, what does the unconscious mind reveal about this artifact? And this should be pretty easy to talk about, right? Maybe if you have a fear of failure, maybe you are encouraged. Maybe you show up early, stay up late, so you get A's in all your classes because you're scared of failing, right? And maybe you could trace that back to a time in your childhood or a way your parents raised you. Maybe think of someone that had to go in a war and see these terrible, awful things, right? And those store themselves in their deep unconscious memory. And so maybe they live their life in a certain way where they still understand the world as being maybe a scary place or a dangerous place, and that causes them to act in ways that maybe don't make sense, right? So yeah, some insights are, a book was written after World War II and the author had a significant amount of trauma, right? And so maybe the book kind of addresses that. Maybe you pick up on some of those themes in the book. What happened or didn't happen to someone as a child led to what's happening to them now. So perhaps somebody had a really kind of spoiled childhood, and maybe now as an adult, they act like they should get everything that they deserve, right? Because maybe they were an only child and their parents bought them everything they ever wanted. Well, they're probably going to keep acting like that as an adult unless they really sat down and had to think through some of that stuff. So those are our lenses. You can definitely combine them. We can see here's looking at that Marxist lens centering race. We can see class struggle kind of ties into everything, unfortunately. And then what we did was we watched this Aladdin music video and we practiced applying some of those lenses. So hopefully this was helpful. You can go back and revisit this. Other than that, let's go ahead and end it.